Previously in this series, I talked about the first settlers who came to Watauga County and the general outline, and in this video, I'm going to be talking about how the county actually officially formed, and then the first proper settlements in Boone, North Carolina. Boone, North Carolina, a small city nestled in the heart of the Blue Ridge Mountains, home to Appalachian State University. My name is Fabiano, and in this series, I'm taking a look through the history to see how Boone formed and where it's going. The first proper large migration to Watauga County was largely due to the American Revolution. It had two factors. The first one was those that were loyalists that did not want to revolt from Britain, and they wanted to get away from the rest of North Carolina because obviously, as is famously known, Charlotte, North Carolina was the hornet's nest of rebellion. So they wanted to get farther away from that, up into the mountains where they can, have their British sympathies and not fear, to get tarred and feathered. And then the other group of people was the soldiers who fought, especially in the Battle of Kings Mountain. A lot of soldiers fought there. That's down near South Carolina, North Carolina border in the Appalachian Trail. They came up farther and went into the places in the rest of Western North Carolina, especially around Watauga County near Tennessee up here. An example of one of these loyalists was Benjamin Howard. So he lived in Wilkes County, and during the war he spent pretty much all his time in this area. He tried his best to not get into any trouble with his patriotic neighbors, but eventually he got driven out of the town and had to eventually camp out on a mountain north of Boone. And the mountain he camped out on is actually the mountain that is now called Howard's Knob, which is the most famous mountain of Boone, North Carolina. It's the one that directly overlooks the town, the campus of App State, so it's a very interesting fact to know where that came from. And then as for Benjamin Howard himself, before the war was over, he took an oath of allegiance in 1778 to the United States, so he remained a citizen of America. And then his daughter was also very patriotic, but she initially refused to tell anyone where he was hiding. And a neat fact is actually his daughter, from what I've found, is that his daughter married Jordan Councill, who was another settler who established the first store that I'll talk about later in this video. As settlement grew in Western North Carolina, there were a lot of people who were completely politically absent from the rest of the state. Specifically, white settlements from the Watauga River to the Nolichucky River, I think I'm pronouncing that correctly, they famously wanted to form the state of Franklin. They named it after Benjamin Franklin because they hoped he would get political support for them, which didn't pan out. But they were, in the mountains, they completely were just absent from, Raleigh, and they didn't want to be part of North Carolina. And again, like I mentioned last video, there was a settlement called the Watauga Settlement, which was in where modern day Tennessee is. And that's pretty much all founding of Tennessee stuff. But again, the founding of Tennessee and the proposed state of Franklin, they were basically right next to Watauga County. Watauga County currently borders the state of Tennessee. So all of that was affecting these people, and these people, if Franklin was proposed, would have had to decide, do we want to stay in North Carolina or do we want to leave North Carolina and join Tennessee? As far as the oldest settlements in Boone and Watauga County go, first we have Jordan Councill, who I just mentioned. He established his store in 1790. It was just a very simple pioneer general store where people can buy and trade whatever they needed to. And then there's also the first proper settlement, which was called Meat Camp. From what I learned last semester in one of my classes, I'm pretty sure it was called Meat Camp because it was a big, I think it was a hog farm where obviously, they produced meat, so that's why it was called that. And then later on, around the 1830s, you had the towns of Valley Crucis and then Clear Creek and then eventually Deep Gap. And a lot of these early settlers were from the rest of North Carolina. They came west, and the really, really rich ones had settlements that were not directly in the mountains. They wanted to stay in the foothills, especially the ones that owned slaves. They wanted to, be able to produce large tobacco and cotton farms, and you can't really do that in the very mountainous regions of Western North Carolina. And then the families that matter for Boone specifically is the Councill family, the Hardin family, the Howard family, and the Coffee family. And if you have ever been to Boone, I guarantee you have probably heard of something with these names on it. Obviously, we have Howard's Knob. We have Coffee Farm. I don't really remember where that is. We have Harding Street, which is like one of the roads that's on campus. And then obviously you had Councill Store, which changed its name, but it's still like big founding Boone things. Watauga County was properly incorporated on January 27th, 1849 by the NC General Assembly. It was made out of Ashe, Wilkes, Cadwell, and Yancey counties, and there was a lot of opposition originally, and like I learned in my North Carolina history class, a lot of the eastern counties wanted to keep their power consolidated to, the eastern seaboard. So as counties were expanding west, they wanted to make sure that counties in the east were also being created. So Watauga County had to go through in the same bill that also proposed Alamance and Forsyth counties. And then Watauga County changed 2 times. So the first time was in 1861, Mitchell County was formed and they used a lot of land. And then in 1911, Avery County was formed and was pretty much all out of Watauga County. And then now the current present day area of Watauga County, after being shrunk down from the other counties, is around 320 square miles. The county seat of Watauga County was Boone, North Carolina. Even though Boone wasn't properly incorporated by the State General Assembly as a city until 1872, the city of Boone originally started a long time before that. So the first foundings is, like I mentioned, Jordan Councill operated a store here. It was a general store, and the United States Postal Service decided to put a post office in his store. So his store became a big important part of the region, and original first maps from around the time, I don't know if I can find one, but there are maps that say, instead of Boone, they say Councill's store on them, because that was the important part. His store was the part of this state that you needed to go to get your mail from the rest of the country. Now, Jordan Councill himself was a very, very important person of interest in the county. He played a large part in getting the county properly formed. And then in his store, he bought cattle, hogs, horses, mules, and he brought them to market in Virginia, Charleston, and Charlotte. He also bought large stocks of goods from the north, shipped them to Richmond, and he loaded wagons. And these wagons had 6 horses on them. It's an interesting fact to dive deep into, before cars existed. And he basically put a bunch of hides, butter, cranberries, fruit, beeswax, and tallow. I don't really know what tallow is. It's just on my notes over here. And then in 1850, his store became the Boone Post Office. Like I mentioned, it was a very important staple of the town and of the county. And around that time in 1850, Boone had about 100 people. So it wasn't the craziest amount of people. I mean, I have classes at App State that have more than 100 people. My friend, he registered for a class with 300 people inside of it. So that is a small amount of people on that town. And then in 1850, Jordan Councill again donated land for a county courthouse to be built. And then the first Superior Court for Watauga County was held in 1851 in that land that he built. And they also decided on a place where they would hold future courts. So it wasn't just always on that land. And then the first jail, I have this in my notes too, it was built with brick and a steel cage, very, very simple. And then it was torn down and rebuilt out of pine logs. And then that burned down in 1865 by the Union soldiers. And then they rebuilt it again until 1888. And it's kind of like the old Big Bad Wolf and the Three Little Pigs story. The jail keeps getting built up and torn down and built up and burned by the Union during the Civil War. It was a very interesting story to hear about, because again, every town, they need a police office, they need a post office, they need a court, and they need a jail. And their jail in Boone basically kept getting destroyed every 10 to 15 years. And then the last settler I'll mention is the person who founded the Mast General Store. So when I first learned that the Councill store was a thing, I thought that's what turned out to be Mast General Store. I think from what my professor said, it was that it was in the same location, but I confused that in my brain to mean it was the same store. It was not. So per the Mast General Store's official website, what was his name? Henry Taylor. He moved from Valley Crucis into Sugar Grove, and he founded the Taylor and More General Store. Now, the Taylor and More General Store eventually sold their shares to W.W. Mast, who eventually changed the name over time after buying up the rest of the store to the Mast General Store, and this was around like 1897, and that's why it's called, now called the Mast General Store. It has pretty much nothing to do with Jordan Councill. Again, I just always confused it. And then the actual location on King Street in Boone, that opened up in 1988, which is a lot more recent than I thought it would have been. Now, one of the most important things about the formation of Boone was how in the world would the settlers actually get here? So historically, settlers, back then, they would just take their wagon and they would ride out into the sunset. And because, sunset sets in the west, they'd keep going until they got all the way west to where there was mountains. And they'd eventually go up, find their little spot, and then build a shack. Now, over time, that's great for settling, but for actually, like Jordan Councill did, for producing goods and selling them in markets, that's not the most effective way. You want proper transportation and everything like that. So eventually, the North Carolina State General Assembly realized we need to build proper roads, proper transportation, especially train infrastructure. In the 1800s, train was like the magical thing in America. It connected, coast to coast. It was the important thing. And in North Carolina, especially under the leadership of Archibald Murphy, the state did a lot of internal improvements to where we built plank roads, but especially train tracks. However, those train tracks did not reach Boone. The best that Boone could do was, I believe it was in Morganton. You would have to come down the mountain, go to Morganton, which is currently an hour away by driving. So that's like basically a day trip back then. And then you would then be able to get on a train from Morganton to where you needed to go. And then later on, and this is getting way into the future here, away from where this part is, around like the early 1900s, so like 1917, that's when they first connected Boone, North Carolina to Johnson City with the old Tweetsie Railroad, right? And, there's currently this big like tourist attraction, Tweetsie Railroad. That's what this is based off of. So here is a model of the actual train. I found this in the second floor of the library at App State, and it's just very fascinating to see because I was researching this whole project, and there it was, just right there, the train. So now, being, 1920s, 1930s, one could get from Raleigh to Boone. However, you would have to start in Raleigh, go to Asheville, cross the border into Tennessee, go to Johnson City, and then you can connect to Boone. So again, there was still a large, disconnection between Boone and the rest of the state, but it was getting there, right? And then that railroad, like I'll mention later, actually got destroyed by a flood in 1940, and it just stopped existing. But I'll mention that in like the flooding part of this series. So to close out this video, the most interesting thing about this, and especially it ties in with transportation, is that Boone, North Carolina, and a lot of the western part of North Carolina, the Appalachians, they went from being, completely uninhabited, and then slowly got more infrastructure added to them. And just like the rest of the state and the rest of the South, they would be connected if it were not for the dang mountains that just makes travel so hard, right? And we're very lucky that the mountains are, not the roaring peaks of like the Alps or the Rockies, right? These are, nice and flat, but still it makes transportation a challenge. And the large part of the story that I presented in this video is that you had a bunch of specific families. They made the trek, they came out here, and they established their world and their towns. And largely, especially from like Raleigh, they were pretty much politically separate, right? And that's why we can see in the Revolution, a lot of loyalists live out here. And then going into the next part, a lot of Union sympathy was held here in the mountains during the Civil War, because the people out here were not connected to the economy of the rest of the state, right? And we'll see that going forward, right? That it takes time for the western part of the state with all the mountains to get politically and economically connected. And as for now, in the early 1800s, they were pretty much on their own. So anyway, thank you for watching this video. The next part, like I said, is going to be about the Civil War, about the Civil War within the Civil War, which we learned about in my North Carolina history class. Very fascinating, especially in the mountains. So stay tuned, and as always, have a great day.